I'm having a great time.
All right. No, you're not.
I am.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Other than your chair squeaking, it's great.
I know. Fuck. Hold on 1 second.
Hi, folks. This is Louis Hertham, the original Peter Abernathy. Hell is empty and all the devils are here on the Shat TV Westworld podcast with Roger, Gene, and Big D.
Welcome back to Shat on TV Westworld, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Westworld. I am one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, Ash.
Hi, y'all.
And Big D, Dick Ebert.
Good evening.
And this is our deep dive episode where we look back on this week's edition of Westworld and provide our thoughts and analysis on the episode we watched, Season 4, Episode 3, Ane Fall. This is my first time commenting on it. You guys did a wonderful Instacast. Happy episode. No Gene Lyons. Can't be a coincidence. This was a good episode. Pure coincidence that I wasn't there.
I totally agree. I even on second rewatch, I enjoyed it as much. And I'm glad that you were positive as well. I was a little worried that you were going to come in and really hate our bootleg version of Westworld.
I don't know. I was just really bummed that you weren't on it, to be totally honest with you, because I feel like we commiserate when it's not awesome. I wanted to commiserate when it was awesome. So it was a bummer.
It would have just been three people saying, this is what we love about Westworld. And it really was.
True.
In this deep dive, we are going to get into what Ash called probably the juiciest episode of the season so far. We're going to talk about Bernard's visions and the Sublime. We're going to talk about the new park and what we've seen of it so far. And in that park, what's going on with Caleb? Why is he, quote, all she needed? We're also going to talk about the sound, the tones, the flies that we saw, the tower's technology. Big D's going to dig into that a little bit. Frankie, the road warrior, and finally a few odds and ends we just happened to catch that didn't fit into the buckets neatly. But there's plenty to discuss, so no more intro on this. Let's get right to the facts. Ash, we'll start with you. Let's dig into what Bernard saw and what we saw Bernard see.
Really, the entirety of what I want to talk about tonight, as I said on the Instacast, is Bernard's visions and his time in the Sublime, which was very exciting that we finally got to visit the Sublime again, because we haven't since the end of season 2. So let's start by an overview of what Bernard sees. The vision that he has, it starts with his departed son, Charlie. He wakes him up. He whispers. He snatches that miniature maze that he used to have as a child from his dad's hands. Bernard gets up. He follows his son through a door, and it opens into this area of hills that's backlit by this really beautiful sunset. And then all of a sudden, because Westworld can't keep things happy for too long, it turns into a terrifying scene where this beautiful tree just bursts completely into flames and is consumed. And those flames then help lead him to a transition to Westworld, where there's all of these bodies are lying all on the street. And then we get two animals that come into the picture. The first is a wolf, comes out of nowhere and starts kind of sniffing and pawing at the dead. And then this beautiful white horse comes through, galloping down the street. And from there, Bernard then is face to face with the horse as these big TV screens kind of flicker around them. And then finally, Bernard ends up at what we have come in the season to know as the tower. It's the tower from the drawings that Christina sees in the last episode. And we know that Bernard is somewhere, and we've got a link finally to Christina. And this is where Akecheta waits for him, confirms what we knew all along, that we're back in the Sublime. And I know that I have given people a hard time that are like, ooh, Teddy, ooh, Dolores, getting all excited about it. But I got really fangirled out when I saw Akecheta, because his standalone episode, is still by far my favorite Westworld episode of all time. And so he's there. We know we're in the Sublime, and we know that this is where Bernard has been before he got all dusty.
And Ash, you mentioned something I hadn't considered when I was watching the episode by myself. Westworld is speaking to us in Westworld. The icons, the totems that we learned to associate with certain characters or certain things, those harbingers, are being used here to speak to an audience that is well-versed in Westworld. It's almost like they're speaking directly to us, the diehards, and I really appreciate that.
And I didn't even pick up on it, because we know whenever we're in the Sublime that we get the letterbox, the different formats, so we're sure of what we're seeing. When they open in it, I didn't catch it. Until halfway through, I noticed it. We revert back to the real world, and that's when it goes full screen. So I think those little subtle cues help us keep track of some facts in a world that is increasingly ambiguous.
Well, I appreciate, Gene, that you called them totems, because I think that this is where Westworld, when it gets really meta, this is where the meta works, because they are using a maze, which is a pretty obvious metaphor for what their show has become. And we've got these little totems along the way that kind of mark and symbolize our journey so far and hints as to where our journey is going to be in the future. And one of those is this white horse. This white horse is very intentional because it has been something that throughout the seasons has been used to connect to and really to represent Dolores. So in Westworld Season 2, this happens with Teddy. And then it's also in the last memory with Rehoboam when Dolores is kind of talking to Maeve. We get the same image of this white horse. So we know that this horse is either a reminder of her or a marker of Dolores and where Dolores intended Bernard to go, because we have to remember she chose that this would be passed on. So there is a piece of her there that is guiding Bernard and guiding Bernard to what she wants him to do. And of course, we've got the color scheme, right? The white horse means it's not Charloris. This is the good Dolores that kind of, got memory sucked away at the end of last season.
That's a really nice find. And we know through their intertwined processes of Genesis that Dolores and Bernard have essentially left parts of themselves in one another. So this is more than just mythology or Easter eggs. Oh, it's a horse, that's Dolores. Her ghost essentially is in Bernard. Again, that white horse is a terrific totem for that.
And this isn't the first time that we've seen human characters represented as animals. We had also seen the vulture was the man in black and the wolf was Akecheta. And the scene, I think it was after the Gala massacre, where Bernard is coming upon it, the wolf is there. We see that again. And it's either that these are memories that Bernard has and they're kind of guiding him along and he's not aware of it, or the Sublime is kind of trying to ease him into this unfamiliar territory.
Well, what I love here is that we start to mess with this idea of time. And one of the first signs of that is Akecheta, he's genuinely surprised when Bernard tells him what he saw. And he says, oh, you're living through past memories. Like he's almost, surprised that that's what he's choosing to do, which leads us to believe that that is not something that happens often here, that this is not a place of like reflection. This is a place of looking forward. So let's talk about what that means in terms of the time and the timelines that clearly we have got going on this season. So you've got Akecheta here who tells Bernard that basically Bernard can run scenarios about how the world will or will not end. And not the Sublime world, but like the real quote unquote human world. And since time works differently in the Sublime, we know that Bernard has the opportunity to stay there. And for what would constitute a millennia within the Sublime is really only like a year within human form and like human years, let's say. And so Bernard, he's going to stick around. He clearly stays for a few thousand Sublime years doing his whole Doctor Strange business, trying to see what scenario he needs in order to save mankind. And when he comes out, he knows what to do, how to do it, save for like a few details about which scenario he sees playing in front of him. Basically, like, does Stubbs eat the tuna or does he eat a BLT? Like, those are the little butterfly effect type things that are going to affect whether or not Bernard can be successful. And it should be noted that this means that since we saw the host be uploaded at the end of season 2 when the sky split and they ran off into the Sublime, they've had basically like 8,000 years to like kick back, build the Sublime, run all of these scenarios for what the world could be. I mean, it's been a fucking long time for that amount of cerebral processing power to be sitting there working with all of these hosts.
The one thing, though, it kind of bothers me is that he's seen every possible scenario, but why is he then kind of leading all of the characters? Like when you tell someone, hey, I need the napkin, aren't you altering and creating another variable of the timeline? Half the time I'm telling him, I'm like, shut up, stop guiding Stubbs. It's cute, but what you're doing is making the variables branch out even further.
But that's not what he's doing. He's ensuring that the variables are what he needs them to be. He's not psychic. He's not controlling the future. He says to him when he comes out, oh, good, I've basically eliminated half the scenarios. And so he knows what pieces have to fall in line in order for that end result to happen, that all the branches have to connect correctly. And that's what he's doing.
Bernard is the only variable. He is the only thing that can be changed between all these millions of scenarios, billions of scenarios, right? He is the thing.
He is the butterfly that creates the wind. Yeah. Well, and this is a clear juxtaposition to previous seasons. Now, I have complained about the parallels that I think they're a little heavy-handed between like old Westworld and new Roaring Twenties Westworld. Like, I think that gets old, but this is a parallel that I find really, really interesting. So last season, the big bad was obviously Rehoboam. And so Rehoboam was predicting the future for mankind and was making decisions for humans based off of the future it thought was best. And you have something similar here in what the hosts have created and how Bernard has come out of that scenario. Because the hosts have been using their time and power to run these scenarios for whether or not the world will end and how it does. And now they aren't going to choose for mankind like Rehoboam did, but they're at least providing the opportunity to have the knowledge. And think about our colors here. Rehoboam was black. He was solid black. And the tower is clearly white. It's heavy-handed, but this is clearly like the nicer and more moral way to help guide people's futures. And why do we see it? Why do we see the tower? Well, that is a question that was driving me nuts. Where's the tower coming from? But I'm wondering if maybe the hosts know that the tower is going to be produced. And so it's there in the Sublime. And so that's why Bernard can see it, because they show it to him. Or perhaps the hosts see the tower in Christina's world because they're also in the Sublime. So Peter, that kills himself, is drawing it because he also has access to it, which basically might be telling us with big flashing red lights that Christina is in the Sublime too. Because as Akecheta says here, he says it's where they make a world of their own making, talking about the hosts. All the hosts aren't just going to exist around that tower. They all have created their own world. So is that what the ghost of Dolores, this white horse, has done? Are the scenarios that her NPCs that she's writing, are these the way that the hosts are running and predicting the future? And what's exciting about this is it means finally all of these timelines and pieces are starting to coalesce and come together.
I love that you invoked Rehoboam because it reminded me of an email that Discount Don sent in this week. And he was saying basically in season 3, we're watching this and we're like, that awful machine Rehoboam is looking into all the possible futures and choosing what it thinks is humanity's best chance for survival, no matter how many people it kills to do it. Boo, Rehoboam, destroy all your Roombas, destroy all your Teddy Ruxpins. But in season 4, we're like, oh, yay, that wonderful machine Bernard is looking into all possible futures, and he will choose what he thinks is humanity's best chance for survival, no matter how many people he kills to do it. It's basically a double standard almost. As you said, Ash, perhaps it's the kinder approach, but it is still in either way a machine that is playing situations, simulations, and going with the best bet.
But I mean, both Rehoboam and the Sublime, they're coming to the same conclusion. Rehoboam, when I went back and I watched the end of season 3, and they show on screen what would happen if you took him out. So there'd be mass casualty events at 6 to 10 years, then 12 to 16, 23 years, the population declines, and then humanity comes to an end, 50 to 125 years. Shouldn't we start to consider that maybe humanity deserves this fate? We keep finding ways that Bernard's like, oh, I found the one way to save humanity. Maybe humanity shouldn't survive. He's not giving people a choice. He's forcing a future where humans survive. I think maybe we should let them die.
I mean, I think as we've seen quite recently, we're pretty hopelessly overrated as a species. So, yeah, man, I say let it go. Let it go.
I'm shifting to be on Team Robot a bit here, at least for the TV show.
Well, and that kind of leads us to what are the stakes here, right? And I think we learn a few really important things very quickly. The first is Akecheta says that eventually, past a certain point in the quote-unquote real world, all paths end in destruction. So there's basically a point of no return, that if we get to it, there's no saving us. And the other thing that we learn is that no matter what happens, Bernard is going to die. And he's given the chance to stay in the Sublime in a world that he makes of his own, but he chooses to come back. He chooses to fight for humans. And this is why he's a total sweetie, and I love him.
This is one of my favorite TV and film paradoxes, so I was so glad to see it come up in Westworld. And it basically comes in 2 flavors. Flavor 1, which is the character that you love. Bernard, I think we all agree, is like the most beloved character on the show, at least the most universally enjoyed, right? He must sacrifice himself for the greater good. And no matter if the good guys win, he still dies. Tragic ending, curtains close. The second flavor I find more interesting and more enjoyable. It's when you discover that the true threat lives in the savior himself, right?
Yes.
So let's say in this case, Bernard actually holds the key to the bad guys winning, and we don't realize that until the very end, that he has to basically self-sabotage, self-sacrifice to end their chances of success.
I think Bernard is a tool. He's a tool that is going to be used by both sides. And I had to keep reminding myself, and I had this conversation with Gene, that the Sublime and the entities, let's just say, the digital entities that live there, they're not innocent bystanders in this fight between humans and hosts. They have an invested and direct interest that the power stays on. Because wherever they are residing, whether it's in the data center in the Hoover Dam or anywhere else digitally that requires electricity, they could be a player in this, silently pushing the hand of Bernard and other players to guarantee that they survive a digital afterlife.
Thinking of the Sublime, whether it has its own will or it's the collective will of those who live inside of it, though, as being that limited, I think would be a very faulty Sublime. Like, we'd have to assume that it is terrestrial, like possibly in the Hoover Dam data farm, with a finite power source and a will all of its own. And I don't know that we've established that in this show. And again, if I'm wrong on this, guys, please write in, hosts at shatontv.com or go to shatpod.com/TV and give us a voicemail. Let us know what you think. I would love anybody to point out solid facts to tell us where the Sublime exists. Is it exobytes out there on a satellite somewhere? Does it have a ground base? How is it powered? Let us know.
Well, and that kind of brings us to the end of this discussion about the whole opening of this episode, which is we get Bernard's kind of journey through the past that gets him to Akecheta. And then we get these really jumbled up flash forwards that I wanted us to take just a second to unpack. And guys, please know there are so many images given of the potential futures that I'm sure I've missed some here as we're going to go over it. But let's talk about the ones that my pause button allowed us to see. So the first is that we start with a flash of the cabin that Stubbs and Bernard is in, where he's getting all dusty in it, that he comes back to and wakes up in. Then there's the whole Terminator Mad Max people that we're going to meet later in the episode, which Gene is going to talk about in a minute. We get a glimpse of the Hoover Dam. We get the Delos Tower in NYC. And then we get the diner where Bernard kills the people while Stubbs eats his tuna. And then the most interesting is we see the Roaring Twenties park that Maeve and Caleb are at in the other timeline. We see that it's covered in sand and that it's totally abandoned. So for me, the reason this is exciting is because finally in episode 3, we're getting a glimpse of how all these storylines are starting to converge. We have Bernard and Stubbs in what I am going to call right now the future. We've got Maeve and Caleb in the park, which for me and Bernard's storyline is in the past. And then we've got the Hoover Dam purchase at the start of the season with MIB. And then we've also got the New York City world, the Tower of Christina's metaverse. And that means there actually may be a plan this season, which I was getting really worried that there wasn't. And I'm liking the way those threads are starting to coalesce.
Ash, I think you're underselling the amount of Hoover Dam shots that we get. There are multiple control panels, hallways, all of the works within the dam. I find it odd that in a vision that is foretelling the future of human and robot and humankind survival, that they're so focused on the Hoover Dam. Now, this can mean that there is going to be some apex, some big convergence that happens at the dam, or it goes back to that thought that I just threw out there about the servers having a bigger purpose within the bigger plot of the series and this season. But it looks like by the end of the season, we're going to get some resolve on it at least.
Ash, on the Instacast, you perfectly described my position on the new park. My initial reaction was more fan service. I mean, they went through bumping into the guy right at the start of entering the park, the NPC offering the posse quests, the drunk in the street, the butterfly club instead of the Mariposa, the heist set to enter Sandman, the can rolling away from Dolores to who I thought was Bruce Campbell, apparently not Bruce Campbell. And I was very sour on this entire sequence, not because it didn't look good, but because it felt lazy. It felt like pure fan service, and I didn't dig it. But then I read an email from listener Steve Morse that explained hidden in that fan service are the clues to what's happening on a larger scale. Steve wrote in and said the updated copies of the original characters in their original roles might be quote unquote fan service, but necessary for an apples to apples comparison between the old tech, Maeve in particular, and the new upgrades and how the two interact. It allows us to get somewhat inside the mind behind the park and the motives. Creating all new characters would be inefficient, and since Dolores is the one actually running the show, you go with what you know. So looking at the park from that perspective, I really wanted to get into what we could figure out. One, as Big D mentioned, is the Westworld massacre is a known thing, and it's incorporated into the park's narratives, which makes sense for the person running the park. Much like the Westworld audience, us, people in the show are at the park for the show within the show, not the surface level stuff. I think it's a fun play on season one, and I think it's a tongue-in-cheek jab at us, the viewers.
It's hard to say because you even get Maeve saying none of this is real. So now is she saying that none of what they're seeing down there in the plot of the revolt and about Wyatt, or is she saying that this is kind of a setup? And there's a lot of things that we can't really definitively decide. Like Maeve shoots the man in black. He goes down. He's got blood on his scarf. He's down for the count. 2 seconds later, he's back up again, no blood, and he's saying that I'm not the man I used to be. Obviously, he's not the man he used to be, because he's been improved and augmented. But are there multiple Men in Blacks as well?
Not only are there many of them, he's probably like the park's most popular host. Again, I'm saying that this is a totally different park, which is what Steve opened my eyes to. It's a pun on itself. It's a character of itself. It's really getting into a totally new type of experience that we haven't seen. It is utterly different from the original Westworld. And then we see that the real work is happening just one level below all this. At first, I thought this top level park is just a smokescreen for a laboratory, but that doesn't make sense on its face because you wouldn't want to put a secret lab under a place designed to attract people, unless you need easy access to those people. So it's more like a people feeder than a true park that's hiding a lab. But what we don't have, as you alluded to, Big D, is any proof that any humans were harmed in the making of this park visit, right? During the shootout, like you said, Maeve points out the guns they're carrying don't hurt humans. And that's proven when Caleb gets shot. Like Caleb takes a couple rounds reminiscent of people in the original park, and he doesn't go down.
Yeah, I get the vibe that the park is more like a bug zapper. You're attracting the humans to it. You're going to infect them. And that's why you would have the labs down below. We see some dead flies that they focus on the tables. So I think this is going to be a point of infection. You lure the people in. But this brought up something that bothers me. We've seen that Dolores has spent a lot of time upgrading the host. They're going to be more resilient to Maeve's hacks. They seem to be physically improving, but why don't you protect the drones' heads? It seems like this is either an obvious plot hole because they're spending time to upgrade and reassure that these drones are capable of completing a mission. But this doesn't work if every time you can simply dispatch them with a headshot. This is either something to keep the plot moving along, or it's a hole in Dolores' plan that I just can't believe that she would do that.
Oh, I think it's option 3, which is letting them deeper in on purpose, right? Like it's like the whole point here was to get Caleb for some unknown reason because Maeve can tell human from host. So you think she'd warn Caleb that Frankie wasn't a human, but we can chalk that up to distance or whatever artistic license also inspired Westworld to use a Gen 1 host to deliver flies out of Frankie's face. I think a lot of this, despite Steve being right about the purpose of this park and the nature of this park, fan service.
And I think that either Maeve is overconfident or we're willing to see the limits of her powers. She's coming in thinking she can control things and she's safe, where really she's as trapped and helpless as Caleb is.
So when Caleb does get to Frankie or host Frankie, right? Frankie says she wants you to stay. All she needed was you. All she needed was you. And again, I'm assuming the she is Dolores, could be wrong there. But if that is the case, the whole thing is a setup. It might be an entire park that was built just as a setup. So all we know for certain is the park is a trap specifically set up for Caleb. We also know it's experimenting with flies and the black goo and the audio tones. And to me, this feels like one hell of a mousetrap when you could have just sent like 2,000 hosts at once to his house if all you're trying to do is capture Caleb.
They're going to have to do a lot of convincing to me that this was necessary, because this seems like that thing you do where like you're going to like have sex with a dude, but he like takes you out on like a really expensive date, puts on, but like you all know that like it's going to like end like well for him at the end of the night. Like I feel like they're trying too hard here too. They know they're going to get Caleb. Like they know that it's going to happen, and we know that this is like a multi-step plan for them, because let's not forget they've sent a host to like get his real daughter anyway. So like you could have replaced her at the house. Like you didn't have to send him to an opera house and send him through a speakeasy train and build a whole park. Like I'm going to need more information. And I appreciate your analogy of a bug zapper, Big D, but you can zap bugs in the real world and it's a lot less evident than like you go to Westworld and you get weird as shit.
Okay, I got that.
Yeah, here's a crazy one. When he's in the dressing room, you close it off and flood it with flies. The end.
Right.
Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba.
Okay.
Right. When he's on the train, or when that one female host that later, you know, the woman kills all the horses, she almost kills him if it weren't for Maeve. Like just hold him down for another minute and blow flies in his ear and it's over.
Yeah, but I think it's because you don't control the environment. You know, if you sent like the 2,000 hosts to his house, all kinds of shit could go wrong. People could videotape it, end up online. It could go viral. Maybe he gets away. Maybe he gets killed. You don't want him to get killed. You don't know what could happen. You lure them to a controlled environment. You do it. The park can't be solely for that purpose, though. This actually has to serve. Otherwise, it's a really big investment. When you could have rolled out, maybe get the vice president to go out there and say, hey, Caleb, we need you. Come with us on this mission. You know, or
what is this, bad dudes?
Yes, or God forbid, this was just an excuse for Westworld to give us, hey, it's a new park. That would be something that really wasn't good for me. But I kept thinking to myself, what could be so important about Caleb? We're pretty confident, we've seen on screen, that we think he's a human because he's the only person who gets shot, who we see the squibs explode, but there's no injuries. And I'm trying to think, what could it be? Why would Dolores be actively hunting down Caleb and Maeve? And I went back to the end of season 3 and watched the final demise of Rehoboam, so it was fresh in my memory. And anyone who works in IT, Gene, you work in as well, there's 2 fundamental things that you need to always remember: network security and redundant backups of data. So as Dolores was dying in her final moments, she draws Maeve into the Sublime. They're having the conversation. The beautiful white horse is up on the hill. And Dolores is convincing her that humans, they deserve a chance to choose their own fate. That people, even though they're capable of just horrible things, they are also capable of programming kindness and beauty within the hosts, and they deserve a chance. So she lets Maeve know also that Bernard holds the key to the Sublime. This is something that we kept saying nobody knows, but in the rewatch, it triggered, yes, Maeve is aware who's got it. And at that point, she transfers sole control of Rehoboam to Caleb. Caleb's allowed to choose, and he chooses to execute the final command, have Rehoboam erase themselves. So we've already seen in season 3 that Solomon was almost a backup or the original version of Rehoboam that's off, backed up, stored, secured, has its power source. I think it's reasonable, if you follow that logic, to think that there is a backup site or Solomon, which Dolores would like to use Caleb's access to somehow help that with their plan.
With Maeve knowing what she knows and Caleb knowing what he knows, and having seen them attack Solomon or a backup Rehoboam site in the flashbacks, I feel like a story that includes a Rehoboam remnant is just incredibly dissatisfying. And it would push us further into a show with fewer stakes than we imagined. Basically, no victory means anything. No death means anything. Nothing is final. And that's nihilistic in like the worst way possible. We talked about the flies previously, and one of our listeners, Sam, wrote in to propose that the flies provide a bit of a timeline. We can actually tell where we are in the show based on the flies. And when we see the flies do their magic on Anastasia, it's called a test. When we see them do it with Caleb and Maeve, they're still understudy in what seem to be trials. And then when we see the Man in Black use flies, they're functional enough to massacre an entire cartel in the wild, not a controlled environment. If Christina's world is real, then you would imagine that the goo is now working seamlessly behind the scenes. I'm not as committed to that one because, Ash, I think the simulation makes much more sense. But let's get into the goo that we saw in episode 3. So we learned a few things about what's going on here. First, the flies are not nanobots. We see clearly they're organic. They simply serve as a delivery mechanism for a parasite that exists within the goo. And you'd think mosquitoes would make more sense, but Westworld loves callbacks, and watching the flies crawl into bodies is way more icky. We also learned that Caleb cannot hear the tone, right? Maeve can hear it, Caleb cannot. This makes it fairly clear that this would be a control tone that hosts are immune to, but regular organic humans cannot hear. If I'm getting this right, the life cycle seems to work like this. The maggots, they're born naturally. They're fed the black goo. The black goo attracts them to humans. They crawl into people and they infect them. Once infected, people can be controlled by tones, but they aren't fully programmed. So again, a person doesn't have to be infected to not hear the tones. None of them hear the tones, but to be controlled by them, it seems that they have to be infected first. So this seems something more akin to the nervous system being taken over more than the conscious mind being reprogrammed. And that's consistent with what we saw on Hugo, the cartel guy, and on the senator's wife. They're still fighting it in there.
Yeah, I read a really interesting take on this today that was talking about the science behind this. And they were talking about this parasitic worm that infects these fish that this is like a real thing, that make the fish more likely to jump up out of the water so that birds will catch them and eat them.
Oh.
And they're trying to understand why the worm would work with the bird, right? Like why does this worm cause the fish to jump out of the water, and what benefit of that is to the worm, because the bird eats the fish and the worm too, right? And so they were talking about how that's related here, because it's almost like a zombification. And I don't mean like, I'm gonna eat brain zombie. I mean like a zombification in terms of not having control over your own motor functions and thought processes, where your thought processes go against the norm of what you're doing. And I love that these are not nanobots. I love that these maggots and these flies are being infected with a parasite, and the parasite is a double infection. It first infects the fly, because a normal fly isn't going to crawl in somebody's body, right? And so it first infects the fly, and then just like how the birds use the worm to get the fish, the hosts are using the flies to get the people to where they need them to be, to jump out of the water so they're more visible, so that they're more pliable, and so that they're more available to do what it is that they need them. And this, for me, is really interesting.
Yeah, and it echoes back to the Telegraph, where we talked about the example of carpenter ants, right? Carpenter ants being infected with the fungus that causes them to actually value the survival of the fungus over their own survival. But this plan, the fly plan, it all brings up a question, which is, if you want to dominate the world, why do the fly thing at all? Why not just create a bunch of hosts? And Ash, as you brilliantly noted last week, that doesn't match Dolores' grand plan, because her team doesn't want to wipe out humans. I believe you gave the example of vampires, right? They want to control humans. And if you replaced all the humans with hosts, all that does is force those hosts to just be slaves themselves, because they're doomed to live life as somebody else, right? You were written to be the senator. You were written, to be the guy at the truck stop. Controlling humans is different. To do that at scale, why would you do what humans did to hosts, right? Build them in factories and then programming them. That doesn't make any sense. Why not instead take a cue from Mother Nature and do things the organic way? One, it's easy to scale. It just keeps happening on its own. Two, it takes a lot less planning. I mean, once you've introduced the goo into Earth's ecosystem, flies will do the rest. They'll infect people. Those people will obey the tones. And if those people should die violently, or maybe even when they poop, more flies eat the goo and it keeps spreading. And this would kind of explain why people fighting for the cause live in the middle of the desert and why they wear helmets.
It would make sense. You would want to cover up all of your openings. Caleb, you just saw the damn flies and you're opening your mouth, you're screaming. Wouldn't you be like pulling your shirt over your head, Gene, or doing something?
I mean, I always say this when I watch vampire movies, though, right? It's like only I think like Underworld got it right. It's like wear fucking neck protection, wear some body armor for God's sake.
Mm-hmm.
You could live thousands of years potentially if you're just a little more careful.
In the show that's given us very little this year, other than to know that these sounds can be heard by birds and random homeless people, we finally get some much needed details on how it may function. So I started to analyze the displays that's up as Maeve is trying to force open the doors to Robo Frankie's cell. And it tells us a lot. It tells us, yes, Gene, like a timeline that flies, that this is above the initial tests, that this is the active trial group 1 is what they call it. And the technology that the tower is using is something called low frequency resonance generator. It produces a vibration and not a sound.
I just want to clarify for the pod, when we're talking about tower in this case, you're referring to the 10-foot tall machine.
Correct.
That's inside the laboratory, not the tower.
No, well, what I'm talking about is the audible sound or the low frequency rumbling that we've heard. And Gene likes to deal in facts. Whatever the sound is that's implied that has something to do with the flies and control, I'm calling that little Christmas tree looking device that we've seen on the secondary level of the new park as the same technology as the tower.
Okay.
Do you not agree with that, or?
No, if you want to call the tower and call the little 10-foot tall machine the tower, that's fine. Do it at your own peril.
Okay. So whatever the device is there, that's what I'm calling the tower technology. So that is a low frequency resonant generator, and it produces a vibration, not so much as sound. And we see up on the sides that there are actually 7 levels to this, which are called active induction sequences. So level 1 is the mildest, 7 is displayed in red. So we can assume that's the most severe and the most troubling, because that's normally when the infected put a gun to their head or do something very dangerous. So the show is actually using the frequencies that the tower is using that are below human hearing. So that matches what's really between 5 and 9 hertz. So this reminded me of a Mythbusters episode about the brown note, that they said there was this hypothetical infrasonic frequency that could cause people to shit their pants. And the frequency ranges that they tested were within the range that the show was saying. These would not be heard by humans, but the low frequency vibrations, it was such a possibility that NASA went out and they investigated whether or not this could be something that would affect astronauts. And they found that even though air doesn't do a good job of conveying or propagating these subsonic waves, if there was something against the body that could cause vibrations, it actually could cause real world problems. They had motor function problems, nausea, they had visual disturbances, and it could cause a lot of difficulty for the people and the astronauts to communicate. So this technology, even though it sounds ridiculous of these subsonic tones, there is some basis in fact that could make this a way that they could control people.
We know with radio waves, the way radio works, if you think about like FM frequencies, AM frequencies, right? There is basically information that is encoded into the frequency and then is decoded by the receiver, right? So the transmitter pumps it out like music on the radio, right? Then it's received on another end and that is turned into sound, right, by the receiver, which would answer the question that was posed to us previously on the podcast. Is the host controlling them directly like a marionette? Is the fly pre-programmed? We've ruled out pre-programmed. We don't know if hosts are doing direct control, but maybe it's just the power of suggestion, right? And now it just remains to be seen, can these directions actually be broadcast on a wider scale, or is the existence of the tower simply conditioning people to be controlled? Moving on from the science here, though, let's get to the plot and this mystery woman who takes Bernard and Stubbs to meet the cause. I'm not saying it's Frankie, but it's probably Frankie. And if that is Frankie, Caleb's daughter, we see now she's a woman maybe in her 20s, early 30s. That means Bernard was out for probably about 15 years. But as you had said, Ash, that's a very long time in the Sublime.
I don't know about y'all, but I wish that we hadn't found out her name. I think it's kind of like a lame reveal to us that it's so obvious that it's Frankie, that it's, that this is an alternate timeline. Because I don't know about you, but I remember the reveal about William's daughter in season 2, where she's got that great opening at the Raj. It wasn't clear that that's who it was. This is just a bummer because it feels like, well, it looks like her. It sounds like her, like it's her.
Could she be wearing a helmet? Do a Mandalorian thing. She wears a helmet for like the next 2 episodes. Yeah. And then when she takes it off, we're like, oh, fuck.
Oh, shit. It's Frankie. Like, they might as well put a name tag on her.
Exactly. You got the whole Mandalorian motorcycle gang. Why couldn't you have put her in a helmet? That would work. They caption her and they actually have her credited as the character C. Come on. You've revealed it once that we see young Frankie is not abducted and that the host that is down on the second level of Westworld is a robot. It's got to be the two. It has to.
Now, you guys talked about homage versus being derivative. The first thing that popped into all our heads with this scene was it's the Terminator's War Against the Machines, right? Starring Frankie as a hybrid between John Connor and Sarah Connor. But let's slow down here. So we don't know that Frankie is the leader of the cause. She doesn't seem to be the one in charge. We also don't know that Caleb is dead. Like, he could still be involved too. And we don't know what's happening in this world because all we've seen so far is a dusty old diner, which seems to be operating as usual. There's still tuna melts in this world. There's still coffee. And only the cause seems to be driving futuristic vehicles. And apparently also the Second Amendment is still in effect.
Well, yeah, but, I think something that's really important here is that they call the area that they go to with those really cool-ass mirrors that break the lasers, they call it the condemned lands. And that's what Bernard has to go to. And for me, that's a pretty dark name for a place, right? Like, why are they condemned? Who condemned them? Was there an event that caused the area to be, like, off limits and be condemned? For me, I think it's pretty obvious, as much as it is this is Frankie, that this is a desert. I think it's probably where Maeve and Caleb are at now, that this is in the future, and we're going to get to see that part of Bernard's vision that, it's all going to be understand.
I like it, Ash. I like you coming to Crazy Town with me. If you look at the sign as they're driving in, it says contaminated zone with the radioactive symbol. So I think this might be part of that mass casualty event that Rehoboam and the Sublime predicted. It's radioactive. I'm going to jump to some conclusions.
I just don't know how you're able to walk on Tuesday mornings. Like, how do you get to work? How do you drive a car when your legs are just so exhausted?
I'm right. It's a nuclear explosion, Gene. Come on. It's the apocalypse, dude.
I don't think that. So I won't go to Crazy Town with you. But I mean, is it crazy when we got the vision at the beginning? Like, I think it's just connecting it, right?
Okay. So maybe it was a nuclear reactor that had a meltdown. It was something about clean energy.
Oh, my God.
But Gene, in Terminator, when they're trying to identify the Terminators that are coming in, to assassinate or destroy humanity, when they're entering the base, they have a way to test for Terminators. They had like a scanner, and they also had dogs. Are you telling me that the humans have not come up with a way to test to see if they're a host? Could host really have infiltrated the base? Wouldn't you have like an injection or a scanner that you would do?
I mean, we saw how well shit went in season 2. I don't know, but
well, yeah, that's true. Good point.
The final thing that we learn is that the cause is looking for a weapon buried beneath the sand. Could be sitting on top of a long forgotten park that only a select few knew about. Is it William? Like, is it the original William who's in cryo freeze and they free him and he's such a badass that he can just, save the day? Don't know. Is it the original tone machine that they could like use to reverse things? Don't know. Could it be some anti-goo serum? Don't know. I'm guessing that maybe years ago, Maeve was left behind in the park and she's going to save the day, but that's Crazy Town.
Oh, you full-blown Crazy Town.
I gave you 6 or 7 options. You said a nuclear accident.
Well, no, I was joking about the nuclear accident. I think it was an explosion. It was during the robot and, or the host and human battles. That's where we got that from.
You're saying that's more reasonable than any of the things I just said?
Yeah, than a buried Maeve that you're going to get? Yes.
Where's Maeve right now in the show?
She's walking about. She's in one of the parks.
She's in a park, and that park is located where?
So what, you think Charlars went and buried her?
Or the whole park got buried?
Or she got buried in a cave-in?
Have you never played Contra or any other video game?
Okay, maybe we're going to see a buried church.
All right, I think we're all getting a little loopy. We should close this baby down and get ready for the Telegraph later this week. Again, if you have anything to write in or call in, host at shatontv.com or visit shatpod.com/TV. The only odd and end that I had to mention on this one is a musical one. I know everyone's big fan since season 1 of the music in Westworld. This time in the Butterfly Club, we do get the piano playing Billie Eilish's Bad Guy. Before, of course, we get Metallica's Enter Sandman. So I'm guessing Charlores is a big fan of 2022 radio lineups because I didn't see a theme here.
No, but this is the first time I thought it was a bit cringe. When Enter Sandman came on, it was like a little bit too predictable.
And maybe they were comparing notes with the guys over at Stranger Things. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Westworld. Thanks for sticking with us. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatpod.com/TV. You can email us, host@shatontv.com. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please be sure to leave a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash and Big D, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us Friday for the Westworld Telegraph.